It was a warm September afternoon when Donna Celia decided to walk to the old train station. She hadn't set foot there in over 20 years, but something that day had gently pushed her out of the house. She put on her knit cardigan, fixed her gray hair, and walked down the cobbled street like someone stepping back in time. The silence of the town was broken only by her footsteps and the faint sound of sleeping tracks. There was no rush, only a kind of longing she couldn't name. When she arrived, she saw that little had changed. The old clock on the wall still ran late. The wooden benches were marked with termites, and the roof creaked whenever the wind blew. The walls, now more worn, still held the echoes of old goodbyes. She sat down slowly, feeling the bench groan under the weight of both her years and the world's. She closed her eyes for a moment and took a deep breath. When she opened her eyes, she noticed a suitcase sitting on the bench across from her. It was made of worn leather, with a frayed handle and scuffs along the edges. It sat there alone, as if someone had forgotten it. She looked around, expecting someone to come back for it, but the platform was empty. Curious, she approached slowly, afraid of disturbing whatever lived inside it. Something about that suitcase called to her. Its silent presence stirred something uneasy, like the past was waiting to be uncovered. She considered turning it into the office, but when she turned around, she saw Sojandir, the old station worker. He looked at her from a distance, as if he had always known this moment would come. His eyes carried a blend of kindness and sadness. "That suitcase. Maybe it's yours," he said softly, like delivering a prophecy. Celia frowned, confused. How could it be hers? She had never seen it before. But there was something in his voice that made her pause. It was as if a piece of her past had been left there, waiting to be claimed. She picked up the suitcase carefully, feeling the cold leather beneath her fingers. Her heart raced without reason. She walked home slowly, holding the suitcase firmly, as if she were carrying a memory. Once home, she set it on the table and stared at it in silence. She took a deep breath. Part of her wanted to open it immediately. Another part was terrified of what she might find. She sat in her old rocking chair and just watched, as if waiting for permission from the past itself. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtain, casting soft shadows over the suitcase. The ticking of the wall clock felt louder than usual. The house was filled with a silence only the years knew how to create. Finally, with trembling hands, she unlatched the metal clasp. The click echoed like an old sigh being released. Inside was a bundle of yellowed papers, tied with a faded satin ribbon. Letters, dozens of them, all addressed to the same name, Daniel Pyrus. Celia's heart nearly stopped. They were her letters, written in her own hand, letters she thought had been lost, torn up, or forgotten by time. But there they were, perfectly intact. At the bottom of the suitcase, a photograph. Daniel, older now, but unmistakable. On the back, written in firm handwriting, "I always come back to the station. You never know when a lost love might find its way home." And in that moment, something inside her trembled. For a moment, Celia felt the world spin beneath her feet. None of it made sense. How had those letters ended up there? And why, after all these years, did they resurface like whispers from the past? She tried to remember each line she had written, each tear shed, while putting into words a love she never got to live. The past had returned with weight, and she wasn't ready. With trembling hands, she untied the ribbon and began to read the first letter. She recognized her handwriting, her voice, the fragile hope in her words. It was like reading the diary of a stranger, someone who had once believed love could still come back. As she read, her breath grew heavy. Time hadn't erased a thing. It had only gone quiet. Each letter was a snapshot of a moment in her life. The fear, the dreams, the abandoned plans. In one, she apologized for not being brave enough to leave with him. In another, she described the silence of the days that followed, waiting for a sign, anything at all. She had written all of them, but never sent them. At least that's what she believed until now. She wondered who could have kept those letters. Was it Daniel? If so, why would he leave them in a suitcase at a train station, as if he knew she would return one day? Or maybe it wasn't him at all. Maybe someone else had hidden them. Maybe fate was simply playing a strange game. Still, her heart whispered, "Go to the end of this." She placed the letters on the table and went to her bedroom. In the oldest drawer, she found the old drafts, the ones she thought were the only versions left. She compared them. They were the same letters. Tears fell quietly down her cheeks. These weren't just words on paper. They were pieces of her soul, returned to her untouched. For over 40 years, she had lived believing her love for Daniel had been buried deep. But now, all of it was there, raw and undeniable. She didn't know what to do or where to begin. She only knew she couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. Her hands shook not from age, but from the realization that maybe this story wasn't over. She couldn't sleep that night. The suitcase sat in the corner of the room like an old friend who had shown up uninvited. Celia wondered what Daniel had done, if he ever read those letters. If he had. Was he still alive? Did he ever think about her? Was it too late for questions or just the right time for answers? The next morning, Clara stopped by as usual. She found her aunt quiet, sitting by the suitcase, eyes heavy, and the whole house full of a strange silence. "What happened?" she asked, worried. Celia looked at her for a few seconds, then pointed at the letters. "I think someone gave me back what time had stolen." Clara sat beside her and began reading. The words touched her in ways she didn't expect. She didn't know much about Daniel or her aunt's past, but she felt, just from those pages, that this story wasn't finished. And maybe, just maybe, there was still time to rewrite it. Clara stayed quiet after finishing the last letter. It felt like she had just opened a time capsule that had stayed untouched for decades. She looked at her aunt with tearful eyes, sensing the weight of everything left unsaid. Celia, in turn, looked lighter, though her face showed signs of sleepless nights. For the first time in years, she was being truly seen. "Who is Daniel?" Clara asked gently. Celia took her time before answering, not because she lacked words, but because they still hurt. Daniel had been her first and only love, an idealistic young man with a gentle voice and steady eyes, determined to change the world. Back in the 60s, that was dangerous. He got involved in politics, was hunted down, and had to flee the country. Before leaving, he asked her to go with him. She said no. Fear had paralyzed her, fear of change, of leaving her family, of the unknown. So love stayed, and Daniel left. Celia believed he'd gone on to live his life somewhere else. She tried to forget, buried the memories under layers of routine and silence. But not even time could erase what was true. The letters had been her way of surviving. She wrote them late at night, crying quietly so her mother wouldn't hear. She never had the courage to send them. She feared they'd arrive too late, or that he would ignore them. Deep down, writing had been enough. It kept alive the part of her that still believed in love. But now, with those letters back in her hands, what was she supposed to do? Clara made a bold suggestion. Find him. Celia hesitated. He could be dead, married, or hate her. But maybe he had waited. The suitcase in the photo hinted at that. Clara, practical as always, offered to help. She said she'd search for him, do whatever it took. Celia only nodded. She wasn't ready to ask for help yet. That night, Celia dreamed of Daniel, the station, his smile, the sound of the tracks in the distance. She woke up with a tight chest, feeling like time was slipping away. For the first time in years, she felt something urgent rising inside her. If there was still something between them, she had to know, before it really was too late. Over breakfast, Clara showed up with an old box of records and her laptop. She had done some digging. There were several public documents with the name Daniel Pires, but none with a confirmed address. One detail stood out: a recommendation letter from 1990, signed by him, sent from a town called Santa Esperanza. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Celia stared at the name of the town like someone facing a sacred place. She didn't remember Daniel ever mentioning it, but something about it sounded familiar. Maybe it was fate. Maybe it was just hope dressing up as coincidence. Still, something inside her pulsed strongly. Clara asked softly, "Aunt, should we go there?" And with her eyes still fixed on the photo, Celia said, "Let's go." Clara wasn't sure what drove her more, wanting to help her aunt, or the curiosity of a story that seemed bigger than any romance she'd ever read. She bought bus tickets, packed a light bag, and showed up at Celia's house with snacks and water. Her aunt was sitting on the couch, suitcase in her lap, holding it like it was part of her heart. She looked up and said quietly, "I'm ready." The trip to Santa Esperanza would take almost 5 hours. It was a small town surrounded by hills and wrapped in quiet. During the ride, Celia barely spoke. She watched the countryside go by, eyes searching for something she couldn't name. Clara stayed silent too, trying to be respectful. "Do you really think he's there?" she finally asked. "I think I need to find out," Celia replied. They arrived in town by late afternoon. Narrow streets, big trees, and a breeze that seemed to whisper old stories. The air felt light, but heavy with nostalgia. They walked to the main square, where a gazebo, a small cafe, and the town hall stood quietly. Clara suggested starting at city records. Celia nodded. Her face looked tired, but her eyes were steady. At City Hall, records were limited. They found 3 people named Daniel Pires in the area, but none matched the age. Clara pressed for older files and finally found a 1991 rental record with a rural address, Estrada das Aguas Claras, kilometers 12. The clerk warned them the house had been empty for years. Even so, they went. It was the only lead they had. They took a worn-down taxi, and during the ride, the driver mentioned a man who had lived there quietly for a long time. Said he left suddenly. Celia listened, her gaze fixed on the fields passing by. When they arrived, the house was old, weathered, with rotting wooden doors and dusty windows, but something about it still held presence. They stepped inside. The house was empty, but not abandoned. A forgotten teacup, a rocking chair by the window, and on the floor, a torn newspaper with the name Daniel scribbled in ink. He had lived there. Celia leaned against the wall, breathing heavily. Clara took her hand gently. "We're on the right path, Aunt. Let's keep going." A neighbor peeked over the fence, curious. When he saw Celia, his eyes widened. "Are you Donna Celia?" "I am." He hesitated. "Daniel. He was admitted to the hospital last week. He's in the next town." And just like that, Celia's eyes filled with tears. The reunion. It might still be possible. They thanked the man and stood quietly in the empty yard. Clara took a deep breath. "We're closer than we thought." And for the first time in decades, Celia felt that maybe, just maybe, life had waited for her too. Celia and Clara arrived at the neighboring town's hospital just before evening. It was small but well kept. In the lobby, Celia felt her knees weaken. It was like standing at the doorway of everything she had never lived. Clara held her hand tightly, anchoring not just her body, but her soul. "We're here, Aunt. Now we take the next step." A clerk looked up Daniel Pierce in the system. She confirmed he was in the cardiac unit. Celia's heart sank at the word. Clara asked to visit, but was told he was sedated and resting. "You can leave him a note," the woman offered. But Celia needed more than words on paper. She needed to be seen. That night they stayed at a modest inn nearby. Celia barely spoke. She sat with Daniel's photo in hand, tracing his face with her fingers. Clara, trying to soften the silence, talked about childhood memories, afternoons at her aunt's house, how she had always admired her strength. But now she realized that was only part of the story. The next morning they returned to the hospital. Daniel was still unconscious, his breathing supported by machines. A nurse allowed Celia a few minutes alone with him. She walked in slowly, as if afraid to disturb the past, sat beside him, took his hand, and softly said his name for the first time in years. "Daniel. It's me. I came back." She pulled out one of the letters, the most painful one. Her voice trembled, but she read aloud. She spoke of fear, of longing, of all the things she never had the courage to say. With every word, time seemed to peel away between them. Her tears flowed freely. She didn't know if he could hear her, but she needed to speak those words into the world. Clara watched from the hallway, her chest tight. Now she understood that her aunt wasn't chasing a response. She was seeking redemption. This wasn't just about romance. It was about reclaiming a life. When Celia stepped out of the room, her face was different, still sad, but softer. "I don't know if he'll wake up," she said, "but now he knows I came." As they exited, a tall man with a hard expression stopped them. He was Daniel's son, Marcos. When he learned who Celia was, his face stiffened. "So it's you," he said coldly. She tried to smile. He cut her off. "My father spent his whole life aching for a past I never understood. And now, you show up? For what?" Celia tried to explain, but he didn't let her. He said he had found the letters years ago and kept them hidden. He didn't want to see his father suffer more. He loved you more than he ever loved my mother. Clara stepped in, but Marcos ignored her. If he doesn't wake up, this is what he'll carry, the pain of a love never lived. Then he walked away, leaving silence behind. Celia stood frozen. Her chest was tight with guilt, sorrow, and confusion. Maybe she should have stayed away. Maybe silence had been more merciful. But deep inside, something still whispered, you had to try. Even in pain, trying meant you were alive. And she still wasn't ready to give up. The next few days passed slowly, as if time itself were unsure of what would happen. Celia visited the hospital every afternoon, sitting quietly by Daniel's bed. She didn't speak much, only held his hand, and sometimes read passages from the letters. The nurses began to recognize her, always welcoming her with soft smiles. Clara kept doing research. Marcos kept his distance. Celia wanted to speak with him again, but didn't know how. His words had pierced deeply. Still, she understood his anger. He had lived in the shadow of a love that wasn't his, and now that shadow had returned in flesh and memory. One afternoon, she wrote him a letter, not to justify herself, but to tell the truth. She placed the letter at the hospital front desk, asking it be given to Marcos. She didn't expect a response. She only hoped it would plant a seed. In it, she confessed her cowardice, her silence, her regrets, and her wish that Daniel had found peace even without her. That evening, Clara asked if she regretted coming. Celia took a while before answering. No, she said. Even pain needs a place to breathe. If I stayed home, I'd always wonder. Here, at least, I face what is, even if it's too late. At dawn, the nurse called them. Daniel had opened his eyes for the first time. Celia and Clara rushed to the hospital, hearts pounding. Daniel was weak, pale, but aware. When he saw Celia, his eyes filled. He tried to speak, but his voice was hoarse. She took his hand, tears falling freely. "You're here," he whispered, and she nodded, crying. They didn't need many words. There was pain, but also peace in their gaze. Daniel gestured toward the window. "The train. Did it come?" "Not yet," Celia smiled. "But we're still at the station, and that's what matters." Marcos appeared at the door. He looked tired, confused. He saw his father awake, saw the hand that held his, and saw something else, something he had never understood. Love that doesn't fade, only quiets. He stayed silent, but his anger began to dissolve. Clara noticed it too. Healing doesn't come with explanations. It comes with time, presence, and truth. That night, Celia didn't cry. She just watched Daniel sleep and whispered to herself, "Now I can breathe." In the days that followed, Daniel recovered slowly. Celia stayed close, helping where she could. They spoke about small things at first. Sunlight through the window, the old rocking chair he used to love. Then, gradually, they talked about the past, about what hurt, about what healed. They didn't blame each other. They simply told the truth. Daniel shared about the years in exile, about returning alone, about building a new life that never truly felt complete. He had married once, briefly. It didn't work. He said her name often. "I never stopped writing to you in my head," he confessed. Celia smiled through her tears. She spoke of staying behind, of family expectations, of fear, of how she had written but never sent, of how the suitcase appeared like a sign. Daniel listened without judgment. Every silence they had lived through now made sense. Clara watched their conversations bloom into something rare, not youthful passion, but something even deeper, compassion. Forgiveness, and Daniel closed his eyes, peaceful. Daniel's release from the hospital came 2 weeks later. He was thinner, slower, but visibly lighter. Celia helped him pack a small bag, and they took a cab back to Campo das Flores. It was a quiet return, filled with pauses that didn't need explanation. When they arrived, the town seemed untouched, like it had been waiting too. Daniel looked around and whispered, "I never thought I'd come back here." At home, Celia had rearranged the guest room for him, but Daniel insisted on staying in the small room by the garden. "It smells like life," he said. That evening, Clara joined them for dinner. They sat by candlelight, laughing at things that no longer hurt. It felt like time had stretched to make space for them. The next day, Celia and Daniel returned to the train station. He walked slowly, cane in hand, but with a gleam in his eyes. The same bench was still there. They sat down together side by side, just like in old photos that never existed. Clara took one with her phone and smiled. It was beautiful and strange. How something so ordinary, a station, a bench, an old suitcase, could carry so many lifetimes. Daniel pulled a small envelope from his pocket. It was the last letter he had written to Celia. He had never mailed it. He handed it to her. "You don't have to read it now, but I needed you to have it." Celia held it like something sacred. She slipped it into her purse, nodding in silence. On the way home, Daniel stopped by the bookstore. "I want to write again," he said to the owner. The man handed him a notebook and smiled. "Every day is a blank page." Daniel smiled back, his eyes full of meaning. That night, they sat in the living room. Clara was typing notes, documenting the entire journey. Daniel watched her with quiet pride. "She's going to tell our story," he said. Celia smiled. "Then let's give her a good ending." Clara began to organize everything: the letters, photos, recordings. She wanted to turn it all into a book, but also a tribute, a way to show that some loves are never wasted, even when interrupted. She gave the draft a working title, The Suitcase of Silence. Daniel suggested something simpler. Just call it Letters That Waited. Marcos visited them one afternoon. He brought a box with old family photos and a hesitant smile. Celia invited him in. There was no resentment, only curiosity. They spent hours looking at the past together. That evening, Marcos opened up. "I used to hate your name," he admitted. "It wasn't fair to my mom, but I also didn't know you. Now I'm beginning to understand." Celia took his hand gently. "I'm not here to erase anyone, only to restore a piece of myself, and maybe of your father too." Marcos nodded, eyes misty. Later, he handed her something unexpected, one last letter. It had been left unfinished in a drawer. Daniel had started it years ago. A letter to Celia, never completed. She read it with trembling hands. He had written about longing, about music, about how Campo das Flores still smelled like her. The last line ended mid-sentence. She closed her eyes and whispered, "I know how it ends. I lived it." That night, Celia wrote a new letter, not to send, not to read aloud, just to write. She folded it neatly and placed it in the same suitcase. The story wasn't about what was missed. It was about what was still blooming. Weeks passed quietly in Campo das Flores. The days grew warmer, the trees full of birdsong. Celia and Daniel developed a gentle routine: breakfast in the garden, slow walks to the square, evenings with Clara reading drafts aloud. Everything had slowed down, not from age, but from choice. It felt like time was finally their ally. One afternoon, Clara found Celia staring out the window, holding a folded piece of paper. "It's the letter he gave me," she said. "I haven't read it yet." Clara sat down beside her. "Why not?" Celia thought for a while. "Because once I read it, it becomes real. It stops being a maybe." Clara nodded. Sometimes it's easier to love the unknown. That evening, when everyone had gone to bed, Celia lit a small candle and opened the envelope. Daniel's handwriting was slower, shakier, but full of feeling. He wrote about regrets, about music, about a book they never finished reading together. And then he wrote, "If you're reading this, it means you came back." The tears came without warning. She pressed the paper to her chest, heart aching but whole. She wasn't young anymore, but she was still capable of feeling something that deep. In that moment, she knew she hadn't just been loved, she had been remembered. The next morning, she shared the letter with Daniel. He blushed when she read it aloud. "I was afraid you'd never see it," he said. "I almost didn't. But life has a strange way of folding what matters into place." Later, they sat at the station again, like they did every Sunday now. Celia looked at Daniel. "If we had one more lifetime, I'd say yes, you know? To the train, to everything." Daniel smiled, eyes shining. "Then say it now, because maybe we don't need a lifetime. Maybe we just need this moment." And Celia whispered, "Yes." The following week, Clara finished the first full draft of the book. She printed it and placed it in Celia's hands. "It's yours," she said. "Everything is in there, every silence, every letter." Celia held the pages like something fragile and sacred. She read it slowly, taking days to finish. When she did, she cried for a long time, not from sadness, from release. She and Daniel took a trip to the station again. This time they brought a framed copy of the photo Clara had taken, the two of them on the bench. They placed it on a corner wall with a note below. Love doesn't leave. It waits. A week later, the local library invited Clara to speak. The room was full. Friends, neighbors, even people who had once passed through the town and remembered the old station. She stood in front of everyone, holding the book, and said, "This isn't just a story. It's a memory we all share." At the back of the room, Celia and Daniel sat holding hands. She wore a soft blue dress. He wore the same cardigan he had worn decades earlier, and even though they didn't speak much, their presence filled the room, as if something long unfinished had finally come to rest. After the event, Marcos approached Clara. "You did good," he said. "You told the truth, not just the romantic parts, the hard parts too." She smiled. Truth deserves the whole story. That night, back home, Daniel looked at Celia in the dark. "I still wonder," he said, "what would have happened if we had gotten on that train back then?" Celia turned to him, eyes gentle. "Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But you know what?" she whispered. "We got on it now, and sometimes that's even more beautiful." And Daniel smiled, because he knew she was right. Summer settled softly over Campo das Flores. The days grew longer, the light warmer, and the air filled with that unspoken peace that only time and love can bring. Daniel's health was stable, though he tired more easily. Still, he insisted on walking to the bakery every morning with Celia, hand in hand, slowly, but with purpose. One afternoon, Clara brought up the idea of publishing the book. "I think this story could help others," she said. "It's not just about love. It's about what we lose when we're too afraid, and what we recover when we're brave enough to go back." Daniel agreed. He said people needed reminders that it's never too late. Celia wasn't sure. She worried about being exposed, about people questioning her past. But Clara placed her hand on hers and said, "This isn't exposure, it's legacy." They submitted the manuscript to a small publisher in a nearby city. A few weeks later, they received a letter. The editor had cried reading it. She said it reminded her of her own grandparents. She wanted to publish it, with very few changes. Celia cried again. That evening, she and Daniel sat in the garden, surrounded by fireflies. "We wasted so many years," she whispered. Daniel took her hand. "But look where we are. We're still here. And that's something most people don't get." Marcos began visiting more often. He brought old photographs, little by little letting go of bitterness. One night, he even brought his teenage daughter to meet Celia. "This is Julia," he said. "She's been reading your story, and she wants to be a writer too." Celia looked at the girl with shining eyes. "Then keep writing," she said, "because stories are bridges. They carry what we can't say out loud, and sometimes they even bring people home." Daniel placed a hand on Julia's shoulder. "Your grandfather was once just a boy in love, and now I get to be a man who was loved back." The girl smiled shyly, and the silence that followed felt like a blessing. As the book gained attention, letters began arriving from people across the country. "Thank you for this story. I found myself in these pages. You gave me hope." Celia read each one with quiet awe. She had once believed her voice was lost. Daniel, now slower and more fragile, insisted on answering some letters himself. He dictated, and Clara wrote. Every word felt like part of a greater healing, not just for them, but for those who had also stayed behind, watching life go by through train windows they never boarded. One morning, Celia woke early and found Daniel in the garden. He was holding one of the first letters she had ever written. "I still don't know how this suitcase made it to you," he said. "But I think God leaves trails when we're meant to return. And sometimes all we have to do is follow." They made a promise that day, to live with less fear, to say things out loud, to hold each other, even in silence, and to never let another year pass with unsaid feelings. That afternoon, Clara recorded them sharing stories for a radio program. Daniel's voice cracked when he spoke of love that waits. Celia laughed when she confessed she used to dream of him knocking on her door. The producer called it the most moving segment they'd ever aired. The station replayed it for weeks. Marco sat in the back of the room during the recording. He didn't say much, but afterward, he hugged his father longer than usual, then turned to Celia and said, "Thank you for giving him peace." That night, Clara found her aunt writing again. "Another letter?" she asked. Celia smiled. "No, this one's a beginning. I'm writing the first page of what comes next." Daniel watched from the doorway, eyes soft. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Everything that mattered was finally being lived. And now, the present was enough. Autumn arrived in Campo das Flores, dressing the trees in amber and gold. The air grew cooler, and Daniel began to tire more easily. His walks to the station became shorter, but he still insisted on going every Sunday, even if just to sit, even if just for 5 minutes. The bench had become a part of him. One day, he didn't wake up early. Celia found him still breathing, but weaker than before. She sat by his side and held his hand. He opened his eyes slowly and smiled. "Looks like the train is closer now," he whispered. Clara called the doctor. Marcos came quickly. The house filled with silence. Everyone knew what was coming, but no one rushed it. Daniel, even in fragility, seemed peaceful. He held Celia's hand the entire time. At sunset, Daniel looked at her one last time. "Thank you for coming back." Celia kissed his forehead. "I never stopped loving you." And with that, he closed his eyes for the last time. The clock on the wall marked 6:47. Later, no one could explain why it had stopped, but no one tried to fix it either. It was as if time itself had bowed in respect, as if the moment needed to be eternal. The days that followed were slow and quiet. Celia didn't cry much. Her grief was soft, like the closing of a long novel. She kept walking to the station, sat at the bench, held her own hand. Marcos helped arrange everything. The funeral was small, intimate. Friends, neighbors, Clara, Julia. Celia read aloud one of the letters, Daniel's favorite. There wasn't a dry eye in the room. Clara placed the suitcase at the foot of the casket. It was never just an object. It had been a key, a messenger, a witness to a love that outlasted time. A year passed. Campo das Flores kept blooming, season after season. Celia aged gently, her hair whiter, her steps slower, but her eyes brighter. The book was published in 4 languages, and once a month, Celia received a letter from someone touched by it. She answered them all. Each reply was a seed. Clara's book became more than just a story. It was read in schools, discussed on podcasts, quoted in weddings and funerals. It reminded people that unfinished love could still be beautiful, that silence could be redeemed, and that suitcases could carry more than clothes. Celia started hosting writing circles at the station. Once a week, people gathered to share stories they were too afraid to tell elsewhere. She called it Letters That Wait. And each meeting began with a moment of silence. The bench remained the same, polished by time, memory, and prayer. One afternoon, Celia found a small envelope sitting there. No name, no return address. Inside, "Thank you for not giving up." That evening she sat in her garden, reading that note. Daniel would have smiled. "You see," she whispered to the sky, "we did something with the pain. We turned it into something that stayed." Marcos brought Julia by for tea. They laughed, remembered Daniel, and told new stories. Clara arrived later, holding another notebook. "Time for book 2?" she asked. Celia grinned. "Only if this one begins at the station." As the sun dipped behind the hills, Celia walked to the tracks one more time. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, and the bench, her bench, waited, not for someone else, but for her. She sat down and closed her eyes. The sound of distant wheels echoed in her mind. A train, or maybe just a memory. But it didn't matter anymore, because she had loved, and been loved, and written it all down. So even if she left tomorrow, someone, somewhere, would find the suitcase. And know that love never really leaves. It just waits. At the station, in silence, until someone is brave enough to open it. The kind of love that grows in quiet soil. She began writing everything down. This story couldn't stay untold. Marcos watched too, at first from afar. Then one afternoon he brought coffee to his father's room, sat down next to Celia. "I read your letter," he said. Celia looked at him with soft eyes. "I never meant to hurt anyone." "I believe you," he said. They didn't hug, didn't cry, but something inside them shifted. Later, he brought Clara a notebook. "If you're going to tell this story, tell it right. Tell them it hurt. Tell them it healed. Tell them silence has an echo, but love has a voice." One morning, Celia returned to the room and found Daniel looking out the window. He smiled. "I had a dream. We were young again, waiting for the train. But this time you didn't stay behind. You walked with me." Celia sat beside him, resting her head on his shoulder. "It's not a dream anymore. We still have tracks ahead. Maybe not long ones,